institutes long-range penetration and inner conditioning treatment of the American people that would cause them docilely to accept such a turgid, horror-filled situation without ever taking to the streets in rage. Well, did Henry Ford say that people deserve the government they get if the people do nothing to turn that government out of office, such as is the right of the American people under their U.S. Constitution? Then they deserve to have liars and deceivers running their nation and their lives. On the other hand, the American people may well be going through the one of the three phases of what Dr. Fred Emery, at one time the senior psychiatrist at Tavistock, once described as social environmental turbulence. According to Emery, large populations groups manifest the following symptoms when subjected to conditions of violent social changes, stress, and turbulence, which can be divided into well-defined categories. Superficiality is the condition that manifests itself when the threatened population group reacts by adopting shallow sloganeering, which they attempt to pass off as ideals. Very little ego investment takes place, making the first phase a maladaptive response because, as Emery stated, the cause of the crisis is not isolated and identified, and the crisis intention is not abetted, but continues for as long as the controller wants it to last. The second phase of the crisis reaction, since the crisis is continuing, is fragmentation, a condition in which panic strikes, social cohesion falls apart with the result that very small groups form and attempt to protect themselves from the crisis with little or no regard for the expense or cost to other fragmented, small groups. This phase Emery calls passive maladaptation, while still failing to identify the cause of the crisis. The third phase is when the victims turn away from the source of the induced crisis and the resulting tension. They take fantasy trips of internal migration, introspection, and obsession with self. This is what Tavistock calls disassociation and self-realization. Emery goes on to explain that the passive maladaptation responses are now coupled with active maladaptive responses. Emery states that over the past 50 years that experiments in applied social psychology and resultant crisis management have taken over all aspects of life in America, and the results are stored in the computers in the major think tanks such as Stanford University. The scenarios are taken out, used and revised from time to time, and, according to Tavistock, the scenarios are in operation at the present time. Translated, this means that Tavistock has the majority of the American people profiled and brainwashed. If any part of the American public is ever able to identify the cause of the crises that have washed over this nation in the past 70 years, the social engineering structure built by Tavistock will come crashing down. But that has not yet happened. Tavistock continues to drown the American public in its sea of created public opinion. The social engineering developed by the social scientists at Tavistock has been used as a weapon during this century's two world wars, especially World War I. The pollsters who developed it have been quite frank that they employ on the American population the same devices and methods used and experimented with against enemy populations. Today, the manipulation by polls of public opinion has become a central technique in the hands of the social engineers and controllers of the social scientists employed at Tavistock and its many think tanks located all over the United States and Britain. Chapter 5. Do we have what H.G. Wells called an invisible government? As I have previously related, the modern science of making public opinion through advanced techniques of manipulating mass opinion began at one of the West's most advanced propaganda factories situated in Britain at Wellington House. This facility, dedicated to social engineering and creating public opinion at the commencement of World War I, was under the aegis of Lords Rockmere and Northcliffe, and the future Director of Studies of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, Arnold Toynbee. Wellington House had an American section, whose most prominent members were Walter Lytton and Edward Bemis. As we discovered later, Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, a fact carefully hidden from public view. Jointly, they centered work on techniques to mobilize support for World War I among the masses of people who were opposed to war with Germany. The public perception was that Germany was a friend of the British people, not an enemy, and the British people saw no need to fight Germany. After all, was it not true that Queen Victoria was the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II? Toynbee, Lytton, and Bemis worked to persuade them that war was necessary, using the techniques of the news science through new arts of mass manipulation via the communications media for its propaganda purposes, tinged with willingness to lie, which was just getting into its described, having learned a great deal of experience during the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. It was not only the British public whose perception of events had to be altered, but also a recalcitrant American public. To this end, Bernays and Lippmann were instrumental in getting Woodrow Wilson to establish the Creel Committee, which created the first body of methodological techniques for dissemination of successful propaganda and for the science of polling to secure the correct opinion. From the beginning, the techniques were designed in such a way that polling, public opinion making, was based on one obvious, but striking feature: it was concerned with people's opinions, not with their understanding of the processes of science. Thus, by intent, the pollsters elevated an essentially irrational element of mind to a primary level of public focus. This was a conscious decision to undermine the grasps of reality of masses of people in an increasingly complex industrial society. If you have ever watched Fox News, where viewers are given the results of a poll about what Americans are thinking, and then for the next hour found yourself shaking your head and wondering what the results of the poll reflected about your own thinking processes, then you could only have felt more puzzled than ever. The key to understanding Fox News and the poll might lie in what Lippmann had to say about such matters. In his 1922 book, Public Opinion, Lippmann outlined Tavistock's psychological warfare methodology. In an introductory chapter, The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads, Lippmann stressed that the object of study of the public opinion social analyst is reality as defined by internal perception or images of that reality. Public opinion deals with indirect, unseen, and puzzling facts, and there is nothing obvious about them. The situations to which public opinions refer are known only as opinions. The pictures inside the heads of these human beings, the pictures of themselves, of others, of their needs, purposes, and relationship, are their public opinions. Those pictures, which are acted upon by groups of people, or by individuals acting in the name of groups, are public opinion with capital letters. The picture inside so often misleads men in their dealings with the world outside. From this evaluation, it is easy to take the next decisive step made by Bemis, that the elites who run society can and do marshal the resources of mass communications to mobilize and alter the herd mind. 1 year after Lippmann's book, Bernays authored Crystallizing Public Opinion. He followed that in 1928 with a book entitled quite simply, Propaganda. In the first chapter, Organizing Chaos, Bemis wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions for the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men that we have never heard of. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. Whatever attitude one chooses to take toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, the trifling fraction of our 120 million who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." In Propaganda, Bemis followed his praise of the invisible government by underscoring the next phase that propaganda techniques would follow, as civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. With the printing press and the newspaper, the telephone, telegraph, radio, and airplanes, ideas can spread rapidly and even instantaneously over the whole of America. To back up his point, Bemis quoted the mentor of public opinion manipulation, H. G. Wells. He cited a 1928 article in the New York Times in which Wells welcomed modern means of communication for opening up a new world of political processes, and for allowing the common design to be documented and sustained against perversion and betrayal. For Wells, the advent of mass communication leading up to television meant fantastic new paths for social control beyond the wildest dreams of the earlier mass manipulation fanatics of the British Fabian Society. We shall return to this vitally important subject later herein. Chapter 6: Mass Communications ushers in the polling industry. For Bemis, His recognition of Wells' idea won him a key place in the hierarchy of U.S. public opinion controllers. In 1929, he won a position at CBS, which had recently been taken over by William Paley. By the same token, the advent of mass communications ushered in the polling/sampling industry to organize the perceptions of the masses for the media mafia, part of the invisible government running the show from behind the scenes. By 1935 to 36, polling was in full swing. In the same year, Elmo Rover began his Fortune magazine for surveys, which evolved into his What People Are Thinking column for the New York Herald Tribune. George Gallup initiated the American Institute of Public Opinion. In 1936, he opened up the British Institute of Public Opinion. Gallup was to headquarter his activities around Princeton University, intermeshing with the Office of Public Opinion Research/Institute for International Social Research/Psychology Department complex run by Hedwig Cantrell, who was destined to play an increasingly important role in developing the psychological profiling methods later to be used in manufacturing the Aquarian conspiracy. In the same 1935 to 36 period, the first time use was made of polling in presidential elections, under the impetus of two newspapers owned by the Cowles family, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and the Des Moines Register. The Cowles are still in the news business. Based in Spokane, Washington, they are active opinion makers, and their support of the Bush war in Iraq was a crucial factor. It is not certain who introduced the practice of advisors to the president. Those persons who are not elected by the citizens and whom they have no opportunity to vet. I just finished
Committee of 300, which is amazing.
Decided the internal and external foreign policies of the nation.
John Coleman is
Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to make use of the practice.
He knew some of these
opinion research and World War II. These were all small lead UPS to the next phase, triggered by two important intersecting developments: the arrival of emigre psychological warfare expert Kurt Lewin in Iowa, and the involvement of the United States in World War II. World War II provided the emerging Tavistock social sciences scientists with enormous scope for experimentation. Lewin's leadership put together the key force that would deploy after World War II to utilize those techniques developed in warfare against the population of the United States. In fact, in 1946, Tavistock declared war on the civilian population of the United States and has remained in a state of war ever since. The basic conceptions expounded by Lewin, Wells, fucking one-upping each other with as the guidepost for manipulation of public opinion. The war gave the social scientists the opportunity to apply them in highly concentrated form and to bring together a large number of institutions under their direction to further the ends of their experiments. The core institute, which was the vehicle for making public opinion, was the Committee on National Morale. Ostensibly established to mobilize support for the war in much as President Wilson had set up his management committee to manage WWI, its real purpose was to carry out the intensive profiling of both the Axis and Americans' population for the purposes of creating and maintaining a means of social control. The committee was headed by several leaders of American society, including Robert P. Bass, Herbert Bayard Swope, among other notables. Its secretary was Margaret Mead's husband, Gregory Bateson, one of the principal instigators of the CIA's notorious MK-Ultra LSD experiments that some experts consider as the launch vehicle for the U.S. counterculture of drugs, rock, and sex. The committee's board of trustees included poll-taker George Gallup, intelligence agent Lottie S. L. Farrago, and Tavistock psychologist Gardner Murphy. The committee ran a number of special projects, the most important being a major study on how best to wage psychological warfare on Germany. The key personnel critical to the development of the public opinion project were Kurt K. Lewin, education and history, psychology, social sciences Professor Gordon W. Alport, psychology Professor Edwin G. Boren, psychology Professor Hedley Cantrell, psychology Ronald Lippitt, social sciences Margaret Mead, anthropology, social sciences, youth and child development. The staff numbered more than 100 researchers who comprised the staff of the committee, and several opinion profiling institutions critical to the project. One such a special project team was in the Office and Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, composed of Margaret Mead, Kurt Lewin, Ronald Lippitt, Dorwin Cartwright, John K. French, and public opinion makers like Samuel Stauffer, later chairman of the laboratory's Social Relations Group at Harvard University, Paul Lizarsfeld of Columbia University's Sociology Department, who developed with profiler Harold Lostwell an opinion research methodology for the OSS based on detailed content analysis of the local press of enemy countries, and Rensis Likert. Likert, a Prudential insurance company key executive immediately before the war, had perfected profiling techniques as the director of research for the Life Insurance Agency Management Association. This equipped him to interact favorably with the head of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, who was the former head of Prudential Life Insurance Company. Likert served as director of the Division of Morale of the Strategic Bombing Survey from 1945 to 1946, from which position he had enormous scope for mass public opinion profiling and manipulation. The making of public opinion 33. According to Tavistock Institute records, the Strategic Bombing Survey played a key role in forcing Germany to its knees through a highly disciplined program of systematic bombing of German worker housing, which Sir Arthur Harris of the RAF was only too delighted to carry out. In addition, from 1939 to 1945, Likert ran the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture, from which major studies were undertaken in the techniques of mass persuasion, or to put it another way, making public opinion to fit the desired goals. One can only speculate on the numbers of citizens who believe their support for the Allied war effort sprang from their own opinions. One of Likert's key aides in the division was Lewin protege and future Tavistock operative Dorwin Cartwright, who wrote the textbook document titled Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, which is still in use today. Another major agency for shaping public opinion was the Office of War Information, directed by Gardner Cowles for much of the war effort. Bernays was brought into OWI as an advisor. It is out of the nexus we have described here that the network of key polling institutions emerged after World War II. They have played a powerful and decisive role in American life ever since. Gallup, from the Committee on National Morale's Board of Trustees, upgraded his activity and became the key commander of polling institutions for launching new policies of the Committee of 300, which he passed off as polling results. Bemis played several key post-war roles. In 1953, he wrote a paper for the State Department that recommended setting up a psychological warfare office by state. In 1954, he was a consultant to the U.S. Air Force, the Armed Forces branch most under the influence of the Strategic Bombing Survey people. During this early 1950s period, Bernays was Public Relations Counsel to the United Brands Corporation, one of the leading corporations in the communications/national security apparatus, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. Then busy with consolidating its power over U.S. policy, Bemis conducted the propaganda campaign alleging Guatemala was falling under communist control that resulted in a U.S. engineered coup in that country. In 1955, Bemis wrote a book about his experience titled The Engineering of Consent. The book became the virtual Tavistock blueprint followed by the U.S. government to overthrow any country whose policies were unacceptable to the one-world government socialist dictatorship. Throughout the post-war period, Bemis was a member of the Society for Applied Anthropology, one of Margaret Mead's social control institutions inside the U.S., and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, a group created by John Rawlings Rees, a founder member of Tavistock to run psychiatric shock troops among the American population. One of its first actions was the unlashing of homosexuality in Florida, a move bitterly opposed by Anita Bryant, who had no idea of what she was up against. The second of its actions was to introduce the theme that non-white people are more intelligent than whites, which we shall discuss later. Likert moved to the University of Michigan to set up the Institute for Social Research, ISR, that absorbed the Massachusetts Center for the Study of Group Dynamics, the principal Tavistock affiliate in the U.S. in the beginning of the post-war era. Tavistock's ISR was the center of a number of critical profiling and opinion research subgroups, among them the Center for Research in the Utilization of Scientific Knowledge, was established by Likert OSS co-worker and Lewin disciples, Ronald Whitfield. Project Director Donald Michael was a leading player in the Club of Rome, and a second subgroup, the Survey Research Center, was Likert's own personal creation that grew to become the most elaborate institution in the U.S. for surveying, creating popular attitudes and trends, among the principal of which were demeaning and degrading womanhood and pushing the superior intellectual capabilities of non-white persons according to Lewin's carefully crafted scripts. Robert Hutchins became famous during this period, and his closest colleague in those early years was William Benton, the founder in 1929 with Chester Bowles of Benton and Bowles, the well-known advertising firm. Benton utilized Benton and Bowles as a means to develop the science of mass control through advertising. It was Benton's pioneering work, supported by Douglas Cater, that led to the development of Tavistock's burgeoning control over U.S. media policy through the Aspen Institute of Colorado, the American home of the Socialist One World Government Committee of 300. In passing, I've mentioned that the science of mass media control through advertising is today so firmly entrenched that it has become a key component of opinion making. In the early post-World War II days, Hollywood incorporated it into nearly all of its movies. Advertising, brainwashing, was done through the type and make-up car the hero drove, the brand of cigarette the swamp Lawrence Harvey smoked, the clothes and makeup the leading lady wore, clothes that became more risque with each passing year. Until today in 2005 we have womanhood degraded by the likes of Britney Spears' almost naked breasts and bare stomach exposed by crotch-hugging jeans she often wears, the social mores that Hollywood enjoys so much in flouting. Degrading women and decline of moral standards. 37 The pace of degrading womanhood has quickened at a remarkable degree since hemlines reached the knee. This is manifesting itself in such areas as near pornography in mainstream movies and soap operas, and we venture to suggest that the day is not far off when such scenes will be total and mandatory. This decline in attractive feminine speech can be traced to Tavistock methodology and its practitioners, Cantrell, Likert, and Lewin. Another noticeable change was the increase in movies featuring interracial dating and sexual encounters coupled with human rights claims for lesbians in the most blatantly open form. Special people were selected and trained for this task, probably the best known of many being Ellen DeGeneres, who received hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free publicity under the guise of being interviewed on talk shows and discussion groups on the subject of same-sex love, meaning encounters between two females involving a type of sex practice. Benton, the pioneer in degrading womanhood, had as his mentor social scientists leading expert in profiling theory at Tavistock, one Harold Laswell, who together with Benton founded the American Policy Commission in 1940. Laswell's joint venture with Benton marked the clearest link between Aspen's hidden socialist One World Government operations in America and the Tavistock Institute. Aspen became the headquarters of a committee of 300 branches in the United. Hedley Cantrell, Likert, and Lewin, with their humanistic psychology brainwashing applied methodology, played an increasingly vital role in using opinion research to bring about paradigm shifts, value shifts in society, such as those just described, but on an expanded range and reaching into every level of society that comprised Western civilization as it had been known for centuries. Cantrell's home base from where he conducted his war operations against the American people was the Office of Public Opinion Research at Princeton University, founded in 1940, the same year in which Cantrell wrote his book entitled The Invasion from Mars, a detailed analysis about how the population of the New York, New Jersey area reacted with fear and panic to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, broadcast in 1938. How could they have known that they were part of a profiling venture, since it is reasonable to conclude that in 1938 not 1 in 5 million had ever heard of Hedley Cantrell or the Tavistock Institute? It would be interesting to find out how many Americans have heard of Tavistock now in 2005. Most would remember Orson Welles, but the probabilities are that 99% of the population would not attach any significance to the name, Cantrell, or have any knowledge of the Tavistock Institute. Let us recount the events of the night of October 30th, 1938, because the same techniques have been used by the Bush administration, the Defense Department, and the CIA to shape the public perception of the events that led up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and are still very much in use in 2005. In 1938, Orson Welles had created quite a reputation for himself as a master at staging faux news events by making use of the English author H.G. Wells, a former MI6 operator, in his book, The War of the Worlds. In the radio adaptation of the Wells work, The Other Wells interrupted radio programs in New Jersey with an announcement that Martians had just landed. The Martian invasion has begun, said Orson Welles. During the 4-hour-long production, it was announced no less than 4 times that what radio audiences were listening to was a fictitious reenactment of what it would be like if H.G. Wells' story had come to life. But that availed nothing. Panic gripped millions of people who fled from their homes in terror, jamming roads and communication systems. What was the purpose of the hoax? In the first instance, it was to gauge just how effective Cantle and Tavistock's methods were in practice, and perhaps of greater importance, it was to set the stage for the coming war in Europe, in which news broadcasts would play a crucial role in information gathering and dissemination as an established source of reliable information, as well as a forum for directing public opinion. 2 days after the Martian invasion news broadcast, an editorial in the New York Times headed "Terror by Radio" inadvertently shed light on what Tavistock had in mind for the American people in the coming war now looming closer. What began as entertainment might readily have ended in disaster, the editorial said. Radio officials had a responsibility and should think twice before mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying. What the Times had inadvertently stumbled onto was the wave of the future seen through the eyes of the theoreticians at Tavistock. Henceforth, mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying that it would be taken as fact, was to be standard practice for the graduates of Tavistock. All news broadcasts were to be adaptations of news and fiction in a skillful blend so as to make the one unrecognizable from the other. In fact, Tavistock put their newly tested theory into practice a year later when the population of cities in Europe, London, Paris, and Amsterdam were smitten with war jitters. Even as Neville Chamberlain was successfully avoiding war, using the same techniques that were employed in the October 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts. How individuals and groups react to blending fact with fiction. 41 Cantle's conclusion was that the public reacted exactly as his profiling research experiments had led him to believe it would. That Sunday night, October 30th, 1938 was to become a landmark date in his files, and a date signifying a vast paradigm shift forever in the way that news would henceforth be presented. Slightly more than 7 decades later, the world is still being fed a diet of news mingled with fiction that in so many instances is terrifying. The Western world has undergone drastic changes unwillingly forced upon it, that it has become a world so vastly different from what it was on that October night in 1938, as to be in another planet. We shall return to this vital subject later in this work. Following the Second World War, Cantle became totally involved with the head guru at Tavistock, its founder, John Rawlings Rees, and his World Tensions Project at the United Nations UNESCO. Profiles on how individuals and groups reacted to international tensions were formulated on the basis of skillfully blending fact with terrifying fiction in preparation for a campaign to launch world citizens of a one-world government socialist communist dictatorship that began to be employed to weaken national boundaries, language, and culture, and to discredit pride of nation and sovereignty of nation-states, in preparation for the coming of the socialist New World Order one-world government that President Woodrow Wilson said America would make safe for democracy. Those fresh-faced young American boys from Arkansas and North Carolina were sent marching off to Europe believing they were fighting for their country, never knowing that the democracy Wilson sent them to make safe for the world was a socialist international communist one-world government dictatorship. John Rawlings Rees was the publisher of Tavistock's magazine Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Their joint thinking mentality is seen in the 1955 monograph, Toward a Humanistic Psychology, and as a progression of Cantle's support for the Tavistock train Gordon Airport's perception of the personality. As he expressed it in the 1947 book, Understanding Man's Social Behavior, in a chapter on causality. Cantle's methodology was based on the conception that the particular environment in which growth takes place gives the particular individual a particular direction for growth. Cantle's endeavors are good examples of the breakdown of boundaries between supposedly neutral opinion-taking and social engineering opinion-making. Tavistock's commitment to forcing major shifts in personality and behavior in all sectors of targeted population groups such as we have sought to describe. Cantle appointed a board of directors to assist in the work, among who were Warren Bennis, a follower of Tavistock director Eric Trist, Marilyn Ferguson, allegedly the author of The Aquarian Conspiracy, Jean Houston, head of the Institute for Brain Research, member of the Club of Rome and author of Mind Games. All Aldous Huxley, who supervised the MK-Ultra LSD program that ran for 20 years. Willis Harman, a Stanford University director and mentor of The Changing Images of Man, later disguised as the Aquarian Conspiracy, passed off as the work of Marilyn Ferguson. Michael Murphy, head of the E-Sale Institute, established by Huxley and others as the Center for Sensitivity Training and Drug Experiments. James F. T. Bugenthal, an initiator of cult creation projects at E-Salem. Abraham Maslow, the leading exponent of the irrationalist think force and founder of HP in 1957. Carl Rogers, Maslow's co-worker at the HP in 1957. HP's reigning ideology was exemplified by a book review in a 1966 issue of its journal, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Reviewing Maslow's book, The Psychology of Science, Willis Harman, a year before his 1967-69 Stanford research study, welcomed the challenge to science from extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, mysticism, and consciousness-expanding drugs, particularly LSD and mescaline. He lauded Maslow's new science since it would bring to the fore hypnosis, creativity, parapsychology, and psychedelic experience, and shift scientific concern away from the outside world to studying inner space. This was Cantrell's original particular personality thinking brought to its logical conclusion. To Cantrell goes the glory and honor of forcing a vast paradigm shift on the way the Western world thinks and behaves. Certainly Oswald Spengler would have had no trouble in identifying it as one of the causes of the downfall of the West he had predicted in 1936. Making changes in the cognitive and behavioral structure. Whatever the particular coloration of ideology that accompanied the scientists of the polling institutions after World War II, the invariant notion of social engineering, trough sampling methods, and opinion research could be found in Cartwright's paper Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, prepared for the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture. The paper was subtitled, Selected Findings of Research on the Sale of United States War Bonds, but as Cartwright makes clear, the war-related aspect of the survey was just a pretext for conducting an analysis on the principles of how perception can be modified to suit whatever ends the controller might have in mind. One would be puzzled as to what the sale of war bonds had to do with agriculture, but that was part of Cartwright's methodology. It was the Bernays-Lipton-Cantrell-Cartwright hypothesis synthesized and concentrated in a World War II setting. The article was featured in Tavistock's journal, Human Relations, which ought to immediately brought the reader to attention. Among the many technological advances of the past century that have produced changes in social organization, Cartwright began, the development of the mass media of communication promises to be the most far-reaching. This heightened interdependence of people means that the possibilities of mobilizing mass social action have been greatly increased. It is conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will. We do not believe that Cartwright had Jesus Christ in mind when he made that statement. Under a subheading, Creating a Particular Cognitive Structure, Cartwright continues, Principle 1. It is considered a truism by virtually all psychologists that a person's behavior is guided by his perception of the world in which he lives. It follows from this formulation that one way to change a person's behavior is to modify his cognitive structure. The modification of cognitive structure in individuals by means of the mass media has several prerequisites. These may be stated in the form of principles. Interspersing his account with examples from the application of his study to the World War II war bonds sale drive, Cartwright then elaborated the principles, the message, i.e., information, facts, etc., must reach the sense organs of the persons who are to be influenced. Total stimulus situations are selected or rejected on the basis of an impression of their general characteristics, etc. A second set of principles investigated more deeply the methods of altering cognitive structure. Principle 2, having reached the sense organs, message must be accepted as part of the person's cognitive structure. Cartwright noted in this section that any effort to change behavior through a modification of this cognitive structure must overcome the forces tending to maintain the present structure. Only when a given cognitive structure seems to the person to be unsatisfactory for his adjustment is he likely readily to receive influences designed to change that structure. Under creating a particular motivational structure, Cartwright analyzed further the social inductions the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in Washington into turmoil for a protracted period. Poland comes of age 47. The Tavistock Clinic in London was where Sigmund Freud had settled when he arrived from Germany, and where his nephew, Edward Bernays, later held court. Thus it was that England became the world's center for mass brainwashing, social engineering experimenting that spread to post-war clinics spread all over the United States. During World War II, Tavistock was the headquarters of the British Army's Psychological Warfare Bureau, which, through the arrangements of the British Special Operation Executive, so, later known as MI6, dictated policy to the United States Armed Forces in matters of psychological warfare. Toward the end of the war, Tavistock personnel took over the World Federation of Mental Health and the Psychological Warfare Division of the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Europe. Tavistock's chief theoretician, Dr. Kurt Lewin, came to the United States to organize the Harvard Psychological Clinic, the MIT Research Center for Groups Dynamics, the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan, while his colleagues, Cartwright and Cantrell, joined him to play a pivotal policy role at the Psychological Department of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the Office of Naval Research, ONI, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, and the Committee of National Morale. Moreover, a large number of influential people at top policy levels were trained in Dr. Lewin's theory of topological psychology, which is to this day the world's most advanced method of behavior modification brainwashing. Important colleagues of Kurt Lewin at Tavistock, Eric Trist, John Rawlings Rees, H.B. Dix, W.R. Byron, and Richard Crossman, plus selected personnel from the Strategic Bombing Survey, the Committee on National Morale, and the National Defense Resources Council, joined Lewin at RAND Corporation, the Stanford Research Institute, the Wharton School, the National Training Laboratories, and the National Institute of Mental Health. The United States government began contracting multimillion-dollar projects with all these institutions. Over a period of the 40 years, tens of billions of dollars have been allocated by the federal government to fund the work of these groups, while additional tens of billions of dollars found their way into these institutions from private foundations. As years passed, these institutions grew and the scope of projects they contracted grew with them. Every aspect of the mental and psychological life of the American people was profiled, recorded, and stored into computer memory banks. The institutions, personnel, and networks kept on expanding and penetrating deeply into every nook and cranny of federal, state, and local governments. Their in-house specialists and graduates were called in to develop policies for welfare departments, labor mediation boards, trade unions, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the National Education Association and psychiatric clinics, and the White House, the Defense Department, and the State Department. It also has extensive contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Close cooperative relations were developed between these think tanks and the U.S.A.S. key polling organizations and the major media companies. Gallup poll, the Yankelevich CBS New York Times poll, the National Opinion Research Center, and others incessantly conducted psychological profiles of the entire population, sharing the results for evaluation and processing with the ubiquitous social psychologists. What the public sees in newspapers as opinion polls represents only a fractional portion of the work that the pollsters undertook to do. A key to the control of Tavistock over key sectors of the daily business of government in the U.S. is that it now has its own de facto television outlet in Fox News, since its acquisition by Richard Murdoch, a virtual seamless propaganda machine for the government. Above this closely knit grouping of social psychologists, pollsters, and media manipulators, resides an elite of powerful patrons, the gods of Olympus, the Committee of 300. It is known in informed circles that the group controls everything in the world with the exception of Russia and latterly, China. It plans and acts out long-term strategies in a totally disciplined and unified manner. It commands over 400 of the top Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. with interlocking connections that reach into every facet of government, trade, banking, foreign policy, intelligence agencies, and the military establishment. It has absorbed all the other power groups of earlier U.S. history, the Rothschild, Morgan, Rockefeller Group, the Eastern liberal establishment personified by the Perkins, Cabot, Lodge families, the cream of the old East India opium trade that generated billions of dollars. Its hierarchy comprises the old families descended from the British East India Company with its vast fortunes derived from the opium trade that is run from the top down, including European royalty among others. In the deeper recesses of the intelligence establishment in Washington, veteran intelligence officers refer to this awesome group, in hushed tones and mysterious language, as the Committee of 300. The leaders are called the Olympians. No U.S. president is elected or remains in office save and except by their favor. Those who butt their control are removed. Examples are John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Lyndon Johnson. The Committee of 300 is the international socialist one-world government that runs the New World Order from behind the scenes, where it will remain until it is ready to emerge and take open and full control of all governments of the world in an international communist dictatorship. Chapter 11: The Paradigm Shift in Education. During the 1970s, the dramatic paradigm shift in school curricula at all levels came into effect, apparently to the point that students were awarded school credits for courses in civics instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic. An epidemic of casual sex and drug-taking overwhelmed school-age teens and swept over the entire country. In July 1980, a major international conference was held in Toronto, Canada, under the auspices of the First Global Conference on the Future, in which 4,000 social engineers, cybernetics experts, and futurologists from all the think tanks participated.
Could have stopped it, man.
The conference was under the direction of the Tavistock Institute's billionaire chairman, Maurice Strong, who set the theme: "The time has come to move from thinking and dialogue to action." This conference will become the launching pad for that important action to occur in the 1980s. Strong was chairman of Petro-Canada, one of several flagship companies of the Olympians. His background was British intelligence MI6, where he held the rank of colonel during World War II. Strong and his network of companies were heavily involved in the highly lucrative opium, heroin, cocaine trade. Strong and Aldous Huxley were responsible for the FSD plague that swept the United States and later, Europe. He was a former director of the United Nations Environmental Program. One of the chief speakers for the Olympians at the conference was Dr. Aurelio Pecchi, chairman of the Club of Rome, a NATO think tank. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was created within the framework of the Aquarian Conspiracy, a project by the social scientists at Stanford University under the direction of Willis Harman. NATO in turn formed and promoted a new branch called the Club of Rome, the name being designed to confuse and dissemble, as it had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Without going into the technicalities of the Club of Rome, hereinafter referred to as the Club, its purpose was to act as a counterweight against post-industrial agricultural and military expansion, a so-called post-industrial agricultural zero-growth society, which was meant to halt America's burgeoning manufacturing industries and growing mechanized farming food production capability. Memberships of the Club and NATO were interchangeable. Stanford Research, the Tavistock Institute, and other centers of applied social psychiatry joined it. In 1994, Tavistock signed a major contract with NASA to evaluate the effects of its space program. The club itself was only founded in 1968 as part of the call for a new world order inside a one-world government. What the club became was an instrument to enforce limits of growth on industrial nations, and the United States was the first country to be targeted. This was in fact one of the earliest steps taken to implement the 300 goal of returning the U.S. to a state of feudalism, a feudal society. One of the industries the club railed against was nuclear energy, and they were successful in halting construction of all nuclear electricity generating plants that has put demand 1,000 years ahead of the supply of electrical power. NATO was its military alliance meant to keep Russia in line. On the agenda of the 1980 meeting referred to above were the following: * Women's Liberation Movement, * Black Consciousness, Racial Mixing, breaking down taboos against mixed marriages as propounded by anthropologist Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson of Tavistock. It was decided at this meeting that an aggressive program would be launched to portray colored races as superior to Western civilization white persons. From this forum came Oprah Winfrey and a host of black persons who were picked up and trained for their roles to portray mixed races as superior to whites. It could also be seen in movies where black movie stars suddenly proliferated until they became household names. It was seen also where a black person was placed in the role of a high position of authority over whites, such a judge, or a district head of the FBI and the military, CEOs of large corporations, etc. Youth rebellion against imagined societal wrongs. Emerging interest in social responsibility of business. The generation gap implying a changing paradigm. The anti-technological bias of many young people. Experimentation with new family structures, interpersonal relationships in which homosexuality and lesbianism became normalized and no different from other people, acceptable at all levels of society. True lesbian moms. The emergence of the fake conservation/ecology movements such as Greenpeace. A surge in interest in Eastern religious and philosophical perspectives. A renewed interest in fundamentalist Christianity. Labor unions shifting emphasis to quality of the work environment. An increasing interest in meditation and other spiritual disciplines. The Kabbalah was to supplant Christian culture and special people were chosen to teach and spread Kabbalah. Early chosen disciples were Shirley MacLaine, Roseanne Barr, and later Madonna and Demi Moore. The increasing importance of self-realization processes. Reinvention of music, hip-hop and rap, by such groups as Ice Cube. A new language form in which English is so mutilated as to be unintelligible. This is being carried over into news readers on primetime television. These disparate trends signified the emergence of a created climate of social upheaval and far-reaching changes as a new image of human beings began to take hold, bringing with them radical changes in Western civilization. A leaderless, but powerful network, the Invisible Army, began working to bring about unacceptable change in the United States. Its rank-and-file members were the shock troops who radicalized all forms of the norm, breaking with certain key elements of Western civilization. Among the Bolivians, this network was known as the Aquarian Conspiracy and its adherents were to be known as Invisible Shock Troops. This massive paradigm, gigantic, irrevocable shift, overtook America while we slept, sweeping away the old with new political, religious, and philosophical systems.
Yep.
It was what citizens of the New World Order, one world government, would have to exhibit hereafter. A new mind, the rise of a new order with no nation-states, pride of place and pride of race, a culture of the past, destined to the dustbin of history, never to be revived. We know from experience that this work is likely to be greeted with scorn and disbelief. Some will even pity us. Terms like off the wall will be used to describe this work. This is the standard reaction when the motivations of Tavistock's social scientists, brainwashers, opinion makers, social psychologists have for acting out their war on the United States are not known. The probability is 90% of the American people do not know that Tavistock declared war on the German civilian population to end World War II. When that conflict ended in 1946, the Tavistock practitioners of mass brainwashing and opinion went to war against the American people. If this is how you react when you read this expose, don't feel bad, then understand that it is the way you are expected to react. If the motivation appears far-fetched and lacking credibility, also incomprehensible, then the motivation does not exist. That being the case, then the action that derives from it does not exist, therefore, ergo the Olympians do not exist and there is no conspiracy. But the hard fact is that a gigantic conspiracy does exist. No doubt Kurt Lewin, the top scientist at Tavistock and key theoretician of all think tanks, could explain it more clearly than we have been able to do, if he chose to. His practice is derived from what he called topological psychology doctrine. Lewin is the man upon whose theories the psychological warfare battles of World War II were fought so successfully, the man who planned and executed the strategic bombing survey that brought Germany defeat in World War II through the wholesale destruction of 65% of German worker housing, to which we have just referred to very briefly. Lewin's doctrine of identity change 57. The Lewin doctrine is not easy for the layman to follow. Basically, Lewin said that all psychological phenomena occur in a domain defined as psychological phase space. This space is composed of two interdependent fields, the environment and the self. The concept of controlled environment arose from the study that if you have a fixed personality, one susceptible to being predictably profiled, and if you want to elicit from this personality a particular type of behavior, then all you have to do is control the third variable of the equation and thus produce the desired behavior. This was the norm in social psychology formulas. MI6 uses it, and almost every type of situation involving negotiations, army counterinsurgency operations, labor negotiations, and diplomatic negotiations used it up until apparently the 1960s. After 1960, Tavistock changed the equation by placing greater emphasis on the technique of controlled environment, not the behavior, but the desired personality. What Lewin set out to accomplish was far more drastic and permanent, altering the deeper structures of human personalities. In short, what Lewin succeeded in doing was to move beyond behavior modification to identity change. Identity change was adopted by the nations of the world. Nations worked to acquire a new personality that would change the way the world looked at them. The theory relied upon the original formulations of two Tavistock theoreticians, Dr. William Sargent's theory in his Battle for the Mind, and Kurt Lewin's own work on personality regression. Lewin observed that the inner self of the individual displays certain reactions when under tension from the environment. When there is no tension, then the normal inner self of a person is well differentiated, balanced, multifaceted, personal. When a reasonable amount of tension is applied from the environment, then all the various abilities and faculties of the inner self go on alert, ready for effective action. But, when an intolerable amount of tension is applied, then this geometry collapses into a blinded, undifferentiated soup, a primitive, a regressed personality. The person is reduced to an animal, the highly differentiated and personal abilities disappear. The controlled environment takes over the personality. It is this Lewin technique that is used on the captives held at the Guantanamo Bay prison camp in defiance of international law and the U.S. Constitution. The gross misconduct of the Bush administration at the camp is beyond the pale of normal Western Christian civilization, and its acceptance by a docile American public might be the first sign that the American people have been so changed by Tavistock's long-range penetration and inner direction conditioning, that they are now ready to descend to the level of the New World Order in a one-world government where such barbaric treatment will be regarded as normal and accepted without protest. The fact that medical doctors took part in the inhuman torture of a fellow human being and felt no remorse would indicate just how far down the world has already fallen. This has been observed as being the basis for the military camp at Guantanamo, Cuba, which was opened there to avoid the strictures of the U.S. Constitution and to provide a Lewin-type controlled environment. The men being held at this psychological prison are now in a state of regression where they have been reduced to the level of animals. Guantanamo is the type of camp that we predict will be established all over the United States and the world, when the New World Order one world government assumes total world control. It is sadistic, inhuman, and beastly, designed to break the natural pride of the victims, to break the will to resist and to reduce the prisoners to the level of beasts. During the first world government experiment in the then USSR, men were allowed to use toilets only to be interrupted in the middle of evacuating and hustled out before they could clean themselves. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo were about at that level when the controllers were roughly subjected to worldwide scrutiny. General Miller, who was the chief capo, has since disappeared from sight. Dissidents who insist on the U.S. government obeying the Constitution and demand their constitutional rights will in future be treated as dissidents, exactly like Stalin treated dissidents in Russia. Future Guantanamos that have sprung up all over America are a portent of the future. On that we can rely. The induced decline of Western civilization between two world wars. Of all European nations, in the period between the two world wars, Germany, as the super-economic, super-racial purity, super-warrior nation, suffered the most, as was the intention. The League of Nations was the first draft of the last approaching New World Order inside a one-world government, and the peace proposals at the Paris Peace Conference, directed and controlled by Tavistock, was meant to cripple Germany and make it a permanent second-class European power, their self-respect destroyed through the social demotion to pauperism or at best proletarian status. It is hardly surprising that the German people turned savage and gave Hitler the mass following he needed to convert his late nationalistic movement into a revival force. We shall never know whether Tavistock miscalculated or indeed set the stage in this manner for a bigger and bloodier war. After all, Meade and Bertrand Russell had stated that what was needed was a world populated by docile subjects. Russell had remarked on the childlike character of the American Negro he had encountered during his travels to the United States. Russell said he preferred them to the white people. He also said that if the white race was to survive, it would have to learn to behave in the childlike manner of the Negro. Yet, in the same breath, the Tavistock emissary called black people useless eaters and declared that they ought to be wiped out, en masse. Russell also liked the docility of the Brazilian people, brought about, he thought, by interrace breeding with Africans brought over as slaves. There is a school of thought that one of the primary objectives of the fiends who planned both world wars was that they would be fought for the most part by a young white man. It is certainly true that Germany, Britain, the US, and Russia lost millions of the flower of their male population who were removed from the nation-building stock forever. In the Tavistock engineered WWI, war fronts and battles were arranged in such a manner that Russia lost 9 million men killed, or 70% of its entire military strength. With the exception of Russia, the aristocracy suffered much less than the bourgeoisie from the economic consequences of war and revolution. Traditionally, much of their wealth was in land, which did not depreciate as much during inflation as some tangibles. The disintegration of the monarchies, except in England, hid the old order of society of the upper classes, who could not continue to serve society in their roles as officers or diplomats, as there no longer are much demand for their services. Opportunities for such service were far fewer than they had been before the war. Some of the Russian aristocracy courageously accepted proletarian or even menial status, like the Russian taxi drivers, nightclub doormen, and head waiters in post-war Paris. Others went into business. Most, however, fell into a life of social denigration. Where the strictly guarded frontier between societies was once impassable in the old monarchic capitals and café society, now appeared large gaps as the lines gradually became blurred. As the Duke of Windsor put it in his memoirs, A King's Story, the force of change had not yet thrust so deeply into the texture of British society as to have obliterated much of the old elegance. During the so-called London season, the West End was an almost continuous ball from midnight until dawn. The evening could always be saved by recourse to one or another of the gay nightclubs, which had then become so fashionable and almost respectable. The word gay at that time meant happy. It was not co-opted as a euphemism for sodomy until the mid-50s. Nor did the Duke explain that the force of change was expertly applied by the Tavistock Institute. The declining female modesty that became noticeable soon after the end of WWI suddenly appeared everywhere and with increased velocity. To the uninformed, it was a social phenomenon. Nobody could have suspected that Wellington House and its sinister social engineers were its cause. Accompanying this testamentary emancipation was a movement of revolt, particularly among young people, against every conventional restraint of mind or body, coming to a close amid the shattered idols of the fallen empires. The post-war generation in Europe revolted against every more and custom, as they fought desperately to throw off the horrors of war they had lived through. Necklines plunged, public smoking and drinking became a form of revolt. Homosexuality and lesbianism became demonstrable, not from any inner conviction, but by way of protest at what had happened, and as a rebellion against what the war had destroyed. Radical and revolutionary excess manifested itself in art, music, and fashion. Jazz was in the air and modern art was thought to be chic. The comprehensible element in everything was "don't have a care." It was unsettling and unreal. Those were the years when all of Europe was shell-shocked. Wellington House and Tavistock had done their work well. Underneath the hectic sense of being propelled forward by uncontrollable events, there was a spiritual and emotional numbness. The horror of the war, in which millions of young men were needlessly slaughtered, maimed, wounded, and gassed, was just now beginning to register, so the thing to do was blot it from remembrances. The casualties made wars all too real in its ghastly and cruel ugliness, and people recoiled from it in shock and revolution. In the despair brought by disillusionment of peace, Europeans, with their superior culture that epitomized Western civilization, were shell-shocked to a greater degree than were Americans. They lost their faith in the rudiments that made the progress that had sustained their fathers and their grandfathers and made their nations great. And this was particularly true of Germany, Russia, France, and England. Thinking people could not come to grips with why the world's two most civilized and advanced nations had torn each other to pieces and taken the lives of millions of their finest young manhood. It was as if a terrifying madness had gripped Britain and Germany. To the initiated it was not madness, but the methodology of Wellington House that gripped the British youth. The fear that it might happen again was what almost prevented the outbreak of World War II. Officers returning from the carnage described to the news journals the horrors of hand-to-hand combat that had frequently occurred in the Great War. They were appalled and aghast, horrified and afraid. None of them could understand why there had been a war at all. The dark secrets of Wellington House and the Olympians remained hidden, even as they are hidden to this very day. Where once the laying of a wreath at the cenotaph in Whitehall, London by the monarch of England had brought solace, it now engendered bitterness, anger, and loathing. The stage was being set for the Second World War, in which Tavistock was to play a huge, disproportionate role. There were the few thinkers who did have something to say, Spengler, in history for example, Hemingway, Evelyn Waugh in literature, and in America Upton Sinclair and Jack London, but their message was also gloomy, even gloomier than Spengler's dark foreboding of the inevitable decline of Western civilization. It was confirmed by the post-war degradation of personal relationships. Divorce and cheating on one's wife happened more frequently. The beautiful concept of women on a pedestal, women soft and feminine, with a lovely voice filled with cadences, the flower of God's creation, the mystery, was a vanishing ideal. In her place came the strident, the loud, the vulgar with clattering grating speech such as was aped and made popular by one particular popular morning talk show. Nobody could possibly know that this sad decline was the end product of Tavistock having declared war on Western womanhood. In Europe after WWI, the Montparnasse in Paris had become a sad place. Post-war Vienna, emptied by the tide of war that had swept so many of her sons away, was even sadder. But Berlin, once so bustling and so clean, became the Babylon of Europe and perhaps the saddest place of them all. Whoever lived through these apocalyptic months, these years, became disgusted and embittered, sensed the coming of a counterblow, a horrible reaction, wrote the historian, Zweig. The political, spiritual, and social bankruptcy of the new power elites, who succeeded the monarchs, the aristocrats, and the old-fashioned bourgeois dynasties, was in many respects more spectacular than that of their predecessors, and nowhere more so than in the United States, with the coming of the socialist era under Franklin D. Roosevelt. This time, however, the eclipse of leadership was not localized in one continent or limited to any particular class of society. The geographical New World, in terms of the problems that confronted it, the America of Franklin Roosevelt soon demonstrated that the United States was scarcely less anachronistic than the Austria-Hungary of Franz Joseph had been. Here he was establishing a democratic New World Order socialism straight out of the model created by the Fabian Society, while the United States was a confederated constitutional republic, the exact opposite. Neither the shift of the European locus of power and prestige from the former Central Empire Western democracies, nor the replacement of the traditional ruling classes within the fallen monarchies to the United States, did anything to the improved economic, political, social, moral, or religious climate of the post-WWI world. The Wall Street crash and the depression that followed bear eloquent, if silent witness to the truth and accuracy of our statement. The manner in which this event was contrived by the Tavistock Institute can be seen in the timetable of events that which we provide in the appendix.
All right. That was chapter 13, Tavistock, by Dr. John Coleman. Get it right, y'all.